time to attend this panel. But before we start this panel, I will like to give a brief introduction to the flow of today's conversation and what our participants will be expecting um, through the panel. So first, I need to introduce myself. I'm Ming. I'm a PhD candidate in political science at York University. My research project examines clean energy and electricity transmission, as well as climate sustainability projects in Southeast Asia through a decolonial and post-human perspective. I also research and write widely on conflict-related gender and sexual-based violence, as well as anti-imperial and anti-colonial social movements across the Southeast and East Asia region. I'm also the founder of the Critical Malaya Studies Initiative, supported by the York Centre for Asian Research at York University in Toronto, on Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So this initiative, the Critical Malaya Studies Initiative, is a graduate student-led initiative born out of seeking for and mobilizing critical research and thought on Singapore and Malaysia within the Canadian and North American scholarship spaces. And the central goal of the initiative is to foster collaborative relations between scholars and policy experts working on Singapore and Malaysia from and in the region, as well as in the diaspora. This event is in collaboration with the Asia Pacific Foundation based in Vancouver, British Columbia, that has been leading important policy and research conversations on the Asia Pacific region. The Asia Pacific Foundation will be setting up an office in Singapore, which I will have Hema give a more proper introduction to the works of the foundation during the roundtable. Climate change has been a central theme in our everyday lives. Many of us impacted by climate implications from the haze, floods, and extreme heat, especially this summer, that has been in mainstream conversations and concerns for many decades. And Singapore has definitely shown its renewed commitment to addressing climate change, evident with the Singapore Green Plan 2030, its active participation in COP's conventions for many decades, as well as the upcoming Singapore Energy Week happening in October. It is therefore crucial to explore Singapore's trajectory in addressing environmental concerns in the present and the coming future. So for today, our panel's key question, or the key theme and question of today's conversation, is what can we do differently in the coming years in Singapore and broadly in the region? What does addressing climate change look like for Singapore? And how can we change our priorities, our everyday structures, and our relations within the human world, as well as with the non-human world in addressing the impacts of climate change? This is kind of like a different kind of roundtable where our panelists will be asked a round of questions on three key areas. The first one is domestic policies, especially on decarbonization. The second the second round of questions will be on international and regional capacities for corporations and mobilization. And finally, on community building and climate advocacy. As I pose the question to the panelists, I call on everyone to think with us in this roundtable what it means to address climate change differently in our communities and spaces. There will be a Q&A session for participants today to pose questions for our panelists, so I hope you will be able to engage with us and our speakers after the round of questions. So today, we are bringing together top emerging scholars and policy experts who are working on issues of climate change, green transitions, and sustainability in Singapore. It's also the goal of the Critical Malaya Studies Initiative to highlight such emerging voices in both research and policy fields. And as the founder of the Critical Malaya Initiative and a PhD student asking questions about climate change and sustainability myself, I'm really, really excited to introduce you to our panelists. So our first panelist is Dr. Hema Nadarajah, who leads the regional and thematic research programs on Southeast Asia, Arctic, and the outer space at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Dr. Nadarajah holds a PhD in international relations from the University of British Columbia, where she researched international law governing the Arctic, climate change, and outer space. She has worked for the Singapore government and has consulted for the World Wildlife Fund. Our second panelist is Belicia Teo, who is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions. Belicia has been in multiple leading conversations surrounding climate change in Singapore, participating in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the COPs, for over a decade, and has been appointed to the Paris Agreement Article 6.4 Board of Experts. Belicia is shaping young minds, currently appointed to the Ministry of Education headquarters in the Syllabus Development Committee for Lower Secondary Geography. Our third speaker is Dr. Yong Ming Li, who is a research fellow at the East-West Center based in Hawaii. Dr. Yong's research focuses on transboundary water governance in the Mekong region, with an interest in hydropower governance, environmental justice, and community-based natural resource management. She's currently leading multiple important projects centering community perspectives on climate change and creating research and educational initiatives related to vulnerable river deltas. And finally, our fourth panelist is Belicia Teo, who is a doctoral candidate at New York University's Sociology Department. Her work is about market-based solutions to climate change and the different moral logics that comes together and all collide in such spaces. She has a specific focus on emerging biodiversity credit market. Belicia also researches widely on the intersections of ethnology and sociology and aims to understand how we can think of non-human animals as important social actors. So I'm so happy for everyone to be here. So before we address climate change in Singapore, which is the theme and the big question of today's panel, we need to first understand what does climate change look like for Singapore and the Southeast Asian region? And perhaps, Ming, I'll have you start first. So what does climate change look like in Singapore and the Southeast Asian region? And how has it shifted over the years? So through our panelists' experiences, how do you see climate change look like in your respective fields? And why do we need to pay attention to the issues of climate change? Why is it so important that we talk about climate change now, especially? Please, Ming Li.
Thanks, Ming, and thank you for the introduction. It's wonderful to be here. My research is a lot outside of Singapore, but I think increasingly I'm kind of noticing that these issues are tied to Singapore as well. So what I'm going to be focusing on is really the transboundary linkages between climate change initiatives in Singapore and what's going on in the Mekong region and broader in Southeast Asia. So, in Singapore, we're known as a very small island without natural resources. And sometimes it's easy to, I think, forget that natural resources are really a core base of, all these green solutions that we're thinking about. They all require natural resources of some sort, whether it's like minerals mined for, batteries or, land for solar projects, forests for carbon credits, or water for hydropower development. So in the Mekong region, I would say that a lot of the rural livelihoods are very much based on natural resources, based on, seasonal and natural flows of the river that support fisheries, agriculture, and other rural livelihoods there. So I think they are very painfully aware of the effects of climate change on these livelihoods. Already farmers and fishers are experiencing the effects of prolonged droughts in the Mekong region. Which also affects agriculture and water levels in the river. So I think climate change in these sort of rural areas and rural communities really should be seen as a threat multiplier of sorts. I think even without climate change, all these communities are facing a lot of issues relating to natural resource governance. It can be related to land rights, it can be related to water governance. Basically, these communities facing challenges in different ways in terms of managing this natural resource base that they depend on so much for their livelihoods. So hydropower, I think, has been emerging as kind of one of the areas in which renewable energy solutions are being talked about. And while yes, it is renewable energy, I think it has been causing issues for a lot of these for millions of rural people in
Mm,
the region in the sense that it is disrupting the river's flow that is again essential for these sort of rural livelihoods, agriculture, fishing. They also pose barriers for sediment which forms fertile floodplains, which then also raises questions about what happens to these food sources that Singapore imports a lot from as well in terms of rice farming. So yeah, I think the transboundary linkages are becoming increasingly clear in terms of over the years, that the links between water, energy, and food especially are becoming increasingly obvious. And
mm,
we really have to think about the trade-offs between all these sectors when designing solutions to climate change. Before, I think there was a lot of concern about the impacts of hydropower, but that debate has also moved towards the drivers of hydropower, which is the energy sector and what's happening in that area and how things can change in that area. The complexity of actors involved in this field, I think, has also become increasingly apparent in terms of the international nature of these investments across different sectors and in terms of where energy is being imported or exported to, or even with food, like the linkages between where rice is being exported to in the region. So yeah, I mean, I'll leave it at that for now. I'm happy to talk more about it.
that's so incredibly important to link it to like for food sovereignty and security, especially with its relations to Singapore. So Melissa, what do you think and what do you see climate change is? I know you're very much focused on Singapore. What are some of your insights?
Thanks very much for having me. So I perhaps will go back a little bit to when I first started looking at climate issues.
Mm,
So I attended my first ever COP back in 2009 when I was a student in NUS, right? So this is my final year, no, third year, I believe. And then I started working at NUS as a researcher in 2010. I would say that initially there was interest because Singapore had at the time already joined the Kyoto Protocol as a party in 2006.
mm,
The Singapore government also set up the National Climate Change Secretariat around 2008, 2009. It also published its first ever climate target under the Copenhagen Accord. So the
mm,
attitudes and mindsets around sustainability, around climate started to shift. But it wasn't quite until I would say around 2018 where things really started to come together. But based on my research and the kinds of projects that the Singapore government would be calling tenders for and did award tenders for to do, included things like studying our ability to use alternative energy, right? And after that study was decided that Singapore was actually alternative energy disadvantaged, right? We can't adopt these forms of renewables at a utility scale because even though we live in the tropics, the reality is it rains more than half a year. It's cloud cover that reduces the efficiency of the panels. The government was also at the time exploring how to deploy policies like carbon tax, right? What will be required, how to enable that, how to calculate baselines from companies that were emitting a lot. And they were even conducting studies on whether carbon capture, storage, and utilization would be viable in Singapore.
mm,
But as I said, I think the shift really took place around 2018. That was also the year where Singapore had designated it as the year of climate action. I believe it was under Minister Masagos Zulkifli at the time. He was Minister for Environment and Water Resources. And as some of you may recall, there was also the first ever Singapore climate rally that took place in the following year. This
mm,
was kind of in line with the whole Fridays for Future, right? Greta Thunberg, 2019, big climate march happening in New York. That same year in 2019, actually, then Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong had also mentioned climate adaptation during the National Day rally. So the National Day rally, for those of you who are not so familiar, is one of the big kind of like everybody in Singapore watches it on TV. It's one of those
Mm.
platforms where big announcements are usually made, right? So by Prime Minister using that platform to talk about sea level rise and to talk about climate adaptation, I think that was really significant. And in general, it reached the masses, right? So it really helped to raise awareness about climate change and the existential issue that faces Singapore. I don't know if we should be using the word existential because it has to do with statehood, and if we do go under, we still want to maintain a state, right? But I would say that mindsets have really shifted in the last decade or so. And I think certainly, I think this discussion is still being held among the youth, among government officers across industry. Actually, as I'm giving this panel, where my team and I at the center based in NUS are actually running a training program for members of the Singapore Public Service on sustainability. So I think sustainability and this campaign to have climate action is really underway in Singapore, and we've some way to go. And yeah, I'm just happy to be here to be able to share this with everyone as well. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Hema, you're an expert in the Arctic region, and as far as the Canadian context, how do you see climate change looks like in relation to the Southeast Asian region?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ming. So a couple of things. The Arctic is warming about 4 times faster than everywhere else on Earth. And a little known fact is that Singapore is an observer to the Arctic Council, through which it has been extremely active over the years. It became an observer in 2013. And largely for reasons because of the expected sea level rise from the melting of the ice in the Arctic. So the Arctic and Singapore is fairly interconnected because of climate change. So keeping an eye out because of the impacts from the sea level rise, as well as changes in maritime routes, is critical to Singapore's interest. And over the last 10, 11 years, what Singapore has been doing is showing up consistently in the north through various means. And a lot of this is through whether it's on climate change research, engaging bilaterally or multilaterally with different Arctic states. That includes Canada through various means. So I remember, I think the very first time I actually met Melissa was at an Arctic workshop in Singapore, looking at energy transitions, connecting the Arctic and Southeast Asia. There are very similar challenges in terms of energy accessibility and affordability in the remote communities across Southeast Asia and the Arctic. And that's a role that Singapore has been playing, is that of a bridge builder between these two regions. And in 2022, the Canadian government released its long-awaited Indo-Pacific strategy. It's a long-term strategy that looks at deepening Canada-Asia relations, and a key pillar in that is climate change. And that includes increasing bilateral relations with Singapore as well as through the various ASEAN avenues also. So in terms of in how Singapore's climate has changed over the years, or at least its engagement has deepened over the years. We see that even more so now. We know that something that we like to say in the Arctic is that what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, and that's certainly true, I think, anywhere else. What's going to be happening in Singapore is also going to be impacting its regional neighbors. What happens in the region definitely has an impact on Singapore as well. So I'm really looking forward to having a discussion on how we can extend Singapore's engagement on climate change, not just across to Canada, but also externally across the region. Thank you.
That's incredible. Okay, that's so important. Belicia, so you work a lot on credit markets and the voluntary carbon market. So what is some of your insights when it comes to climate change, and then what are some of the conversations you have in your research?
Yeah, so in terms of also thank you so much for having me, and it's really great to be here. In terms of, aside from the policy conversations on climate change that are happening in Singapore, there's also been this really big push for Singapore, for businesses in Singapore to both have new responsibilities in relation to climate change and like environmental degradation more generally, and also um take on more opportunities with these changes that are happening, right? So we see a really big push for Singapore to become like a climate hub, a nature hub, with the opening of like Climate Impact X, which is, for those of you who don't know, is Singapore's first carbon exchange. So where like companies can buy and sell carbon credits. And there's a big push for companies to take on more responsibility, both in terms of the carbon tax and also one of the policies related to the carbon tax is that for companies who are under the tax, 5% of those emissions can be, they can use credits basically rather than being taxed for that. So we see lots of different mechanisms being brought in to kind of bring about this kind of responsibility for climate change for the business side.
That's so important. And thank you so much for starting this conversation so well. We definitely see how the different nodes are related to each other. And of course, Singapore being among the constellations of why we are researching climate change in our own fields. So when we talk about climate change, just even in general, we always talk about carbon emissions, like what Belicia has mentioned, as well as Melissa mentioned. So Singapore is very quick in its commitment to net zero emissions, especially in 2022, kind of like increasing its commitment to half carbon emissions. And with the ambition to really meet true net zero emissions in 2100. So this is a question for Melissa as well as Belicia, which I know you folks are very engaged in conversations about decarbonization in Singapore. So what are can you talk more about some of the policies that are in place, more specifically to reduce carbon emissions? And how has it been going? Like, is it effective? Melissa, you mentioned about the existentialness of the lack of natural resources and just simply the position of Singapore. So what are some major challenges and things that have been working to reduce carbon emissions in Singapore? And yes, please go ahead.
Sure, I'll go first.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's just helpful for me to say that so Singapore has a nationally determined contribution, NDC for short, where we have announced an intention to have a fixed level target of 60 million tons achieved right by 2030. So under the Paris Agreement, all countries are supposed to put forward a climate target. We call this the nationally determined contributions because it's part of the bottom-up architecture of the Paris Agreement. So every 5 years, countries have to submit new and enhanced targets, right? If they can. If they can't, they just need to explain themselves, explain why. Now, the thing about the Paris Agreement, it doesn't actually say that countries need to agree to net zero because science is particularly contentious within the context of the UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. In which case, it only says that countries are invited to submit long-term low emissions development strategies. So Singapore, in some ways, along with 70-something other countries, agreed to achieve net zero. Zhi Ming, earlier you mentioned the earlier target. So in 2020, we said that we would halve our emissions from 65 to 33 by mid-century, and then aim to get to net zero by 2100. Or the later half of the century. We weren't even very specific about that. And then in 2022, the tide changed and Singapore suddenly said that, oh, we can actually achieve net zero by 2050. And the way that the government had couched that change in policy was that now that international carbon credit framework under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement was available to everybody. The rules were agreed in Glasgow at COP26, and Singapore could potentially offset its emissions by buying carbon credits from other countries, right? As long as they don't double count it, meaning that the countries from whom we buy from correspondingly adjust. So if we buy 1 million tons from a particular country, that country has to add that 1 million tons back into their inventory. Otherwise, both countries use it. It means that it's double counted. So the big challenge, I think, for Singapore is really like another thing that maybe people don't really know is that Singapore's emissions is about 52 million tons right now. So I find it challenging in some ways to explain to people why our target is an upward trajectory, you know? So Singapore's target is actually 60 million tons when our current emissions is 52. Normally, if you think about ambition, right, you have a baseline where you are right now, and you try and reduce it from there. So it should be going down to 50, 45, and so on. But we're going up. And one of the reasons for that is the economic imperative, right? Protecting growth, protecting jobs. That's what the government says. And whether or not people believe in it and agree with it is a different matter. But I would say that the government does not want to, so they subscribe to something that they call the just transition or inclusive transition, where they're trying to upskill, reskill, retrain workers. You know, they've implemented the carbon tax, right? That we can talk about more if you like. But the carbon tax is also stepping up. It's also been stepped up in the last year or so. It was originally $5 a ton. It has gone up to $25 a ton between this year and next year. It will go up further from 2026 to 2027 to 45 Singapore dollars a ton. And then by the end of the decade, between 50 to $80 a ton. And the reason why it's a range at the end of the decade is because of competitiveness concerns. So if we fix it at $80, then our products that we sell to the rest of the world might be more expensive than our competitors. And so the government has decided that they'll make an assessment of the landscape, right, around 2026 and figure out whether or not they can increase it and how far they should increase it so that our companies don't get too affected by it. But obviously, all of these concerns mean that the carbon tax might not be as effective, particularly also just to mention that we have given a transitory allowance to companies that are emissions intensive trade exposed, which then means that some companies are paying maybe 70% less than what they would be paying under the prevailing carbon tax rate, because by nature of the fact that they import feedstock and they sell to the rest of the world, they are trade exposed. So I'll pause there because covered a lot, but happy to take any questions on that as well.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's so much information, Melissa, and like you're definitely doing very dense research on the carbon tax and decarbonization policy. Belicia, you've written extensively about the markets and like the voluntary markets. What are your views on this concept and this idea of net zero carbon emissions? Or if you want to respond to Melissa, that would be very welcome too.
Yeah, so I definitely don't have the amount of policy expertise that Melissa does. But what I can speak to, I think, is the use of carbon credits to reach net zero targets. So most of my research focuses on the voluntary carbon market, which there are many different markets for carbon, but most of the companies that aren't under a regulatory framework, they have to reach a certain emission target, like companies in Singapore are right now, will be buying credits from the voluntary carbon market. And this speaks to a wider question that you started with about, is reducing carbon emissions the main thing that we should be focusing on when we think about climate change? And I think if you look at what's happening around the world right now, even in the US, we've just had one massive hurricane. We've got another one that's going to make landfall within the next day or so. It's no longer just about trying to it's no longer just about reducing emissions because climate change is here and people are experiencing the impacts of that. And that, ties in with this question of carbon credits. Because one of my earlier projects was talking to participants in the voluntary carbon market. So these are project developers, people who are creating the standards to try and keep the voluntary carbon market regulated. And one thing that I realized is that there are two groups within this market who have very different visions for what the goal and purpose is of it. And so for one group, the key thing that they really focus on is that this market is here to reduce, to make sure that we are reducing emissions, right? And so we really need to make sure that there is high integrity, there's transparency, and that if somebody sells a credit that says that they're reducing 1 ton of greenhouse gases or 1 ton of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent, we have to make sure that they're actually doing that. And if you've paid any attention to the voluntary carbon market in the past 2 years, it's just been hit by scandal after scandal after scandal because it's actually really difficult to prove that those emissions reductions are happening in projects. I don't want to get too far into the technical details, but for quite a number of projects, especially those that are based on reduced or avoided deforestation, it's very hard to prove that the emissions reductions that they claim are happening because you base that against a counterfactual. So you say, in a scenario where we don't have the carbon market, we would have deforested this amount, right? But now that we have the carbon market, we're not going to do that. So you're basing your estimation of emissions reductions on a scenario that hasn't happened, is not going to happen. It's always going to be an estimation. And so there's always that fundamental uncertainty to it. So one group really focused on reducing emissions despite the uncertainty of the carbon market. But for another group, often project developers who are on the ground working with communities that actually implement these kinds of projects, these carbon projects aren't just about reducing emissions, they're also about bringing benefits to local communities who are involved in these projects and who are often the ones who are going to be facing, the worst impacts of climate change. And in the carbon market, these are called co-benefits, benefits that come about with the emissions reductions. And in an ideal world, you would be able to do both things with these carbon projects. And that was kind of the vision early on of these carbon markets, right? With things like the clean development mechanism. But in practice, there's so much uncertainty around proving that these credits are actually creating the impact that they say they are. And so what I found was that there was very real fear from both sides on the market that on the one hand, you have such a strong focus on proving that emissions reductions are happening. And if you want to have all of these, frameworks in place for quality and integrity, that also means project implementation slows down and that there are less benefits being brought to people on the ground who really need those benefits to come with the projects. But then there's also this fear that if we don't slow down, if we don't make sure that integrity is happening, then the emissions reductions that we say are happening aren't happening, right? So there's this, I think the bigger picture here is that the implementation matters of how you bring about those emissions reductions as well. And it also speaks to your point about, Melissa, about making sure that there's a just transition. And I think that also includes, not just policies within Singapore, but broader, like where we get these credits from and how do we make sure that they are bringing about the benefits that they say they are, both in terms of emissions reductions and also co-benefits.
This is an amazing transition as we talk about just transition. I think the question of just transition, and we see how multiple stakeholders are coming into the context of Singapore and more broadly, how the notion of green transition mean differently for different stakeholders that we know of. So we can pivot a little bit into the international realm of questions, but we can definitely get back to Melissa and Belicia on some of the policies surrounding decarbonization. So this is for Ming Li and for Hema. Ming Li, as we mentioned, you're an expert in hydropower development in the Mekong region, and you work very closely with climate-impacted communities in Thailand and Cambodia. And as well as Hema, you emphasize a lot on centering Indigenous voices in your projects. But given your own expertise and experiences, how are these projects intertwined with the communities that you're working with? How is this green transition project, how's the process towards green transition different or similar in your own different areas? We can have Ming Li or Hema go ahead first.
Okay, I'll go. Yeah, I think this has been touched on a little bit already, and I really appreciate like Melissa's and Belicia's points on how these are like very complex issues, and there are a lot of paradoxes involved here, and it's really like no easy solution. So it's kind of like in this spirit that I think I'm going to say, like, I'm going to sound like a wet blanket on a lot of things, but it's not really to say like that we can't do any of these things, but like how can we do it better with with more accountability to the people around us, especially vulnerable communities. So yeah, I think we're trying to understand what's happening on the ground with communities who support these kind of very abstract ideas of maybe carbon markets, of renewable energy. But yeah, the reality on the ground can be very messy. It's very complicated. It's very grounded in, localized political systems and power dynamics in these societies. So it's very tricky in terms of trying to find a one-size-fits-all approach to addressing these issues. So I can speak towards hydropower development. So Singapore, as Melissa mentioned, has faces an issue with finding sources of energy that are renewable. So one of the areas that Singapore has been looking into has been kind of establishing these transboundary power grids and power lines, right? So examples are the ASEAN power grid, or the Australian Asia Power Link to bring renewable energy to Singapore. And in June 2022, Singapore had a very successful importation of 100 megawatts of hydropower from Laos. This was, we went from Laos to Thailand to Malaysia to Singapore. So it's very complex and I think very complicated in terms of technical ways of getting the power to Singapore. And I think this raised questions for me because I've been working in this hydropower space for a long time, especially paying attention to civil society and local communities on these issues. And the ways in which these projects are designed and implemented are not always transparent. The environmental impacts, while there are assessments carried out, there's a lot of politics around who is carrying out these assessments, how they have been carried out, whether they have accounted for the transboundary dimensions of impacts, and also whether communities have been meaningfully consulted on these. So often these projects are presented as it's going to happen, so the consultations turn more into like information sharing sessions where it's difficult for local communities to actually challenge these very lucrative projects. So hydropower dams, yes, source of renewable energy, but again, let's keep in mind the natural resources that are kind of being harnessed for renewable energy. So studies have shown that yes, these projects are very economically valuable, but if you think about the external costs, in terms of say like if you're accounting for the ecosystem services of the Mekong, I think there's been studies that have shown that the external costs of building, say, 11 dams on the mainstream of the Mekong River, mostly in Laos, this would be, about 18 billion US dollars. And so, the economic viability maybe is not that great because there'll be loss of economic services relating to like capture fisheries, sediment, agriculture, social mitigation costs in the region. So are we kind of building in these external costs into our evaluations of these projects? And yeah, I think, even in the carbon credit space, like Belicia mentioned, like how do you verify that communities are actually benefiting from these projects, especially in, authoritarian political systems where accountability may not always be very strong. So I think, there is potential there to work closely with people who work on the ground. So like journalists, academics, smaller and like community-based organizations who have a good idea of what's happening on the ground. And yes, there are like uncomfortable issues that arise. And conflict, of course, is inevitable in these cases. So I think it's still important to think through, how do we work through these difficult issues and placing these vulnerable communities at the forefront of these concerns if we're talking about a just transition.
Yeah, thank you, Ming Li. I think I love how you are also kind of putting out a very important question of like whose development are we really talking about when it comes to hydropower governance. And Hema, could you also speak a little bit more about how your work with Asia Pacific Foundation plays kind of what role does it play in kind of fostering this sort of community and research when it comes to climate change in Singapore and broadly?
Thanks. And also just to touch on your earlier point on
Yes.
Arctic and inclusivity, when we for a lot of us who live outside of the Arctic, it's often seen to be this barren, remote, uninhabited region. But and even most Canadians living in the South forget that it's Canada is an Arctic nation. The Arctic covers about 40% of its territory, and there are more than 200,000 inhabitants in the Canadian Arctic, about half of whom are Indigenous or the Canadian Inuit. So when we talk about the Arctic, we have to take a very inclusive approach. We cannot formulate any policy without consultations with the local communities. And the other point is that the Arctic is increasingly a geopolitical theater. So there is a lot of external interest. China is an observer to the Arctic Council, but calls itself a near-Arctic state. And of course, Singapore is an observer to the Arctic Council as well, although it's a lot more benign. And what Singapore has done to that extent is to, as soon as it became an observer to the Arctic Council, was to engage very deeply with the indigenous communities here. So, a lot of study exchanges, primarily through the Singapore Cooperation Program, and as such. So, yeah, it's just inclusivity, a just transition is key. And just to touch on Ming Li's point as well, on it is a very complicated affair. It is quite sometimes naive or easy to say that we should not develop the Arctic at all. It should remain untouched, and therefore, there should not be any development at all. And it is a very pristine environment, and we should try to keep it as such. But there are communities living there, who are already impacted by climate change. The sea ice is changing, their traditional livelihoods are changing. And we need to keep that in mind and try to strike a balance between sustainably developing the Arctic while also ensuring that climate change solutions or climate targets are still being met. So it is a very complicated affair, and we certainly cannot do that without having everyone at the table. As to the Asia Pacific Foundation, so we've been around for about 40 years, and we are the premier think tank, or really the only think tank that works on deepening Canada-Asia relations. And with the recent Indo-Pacific strategy and a lot more interest and funding, especially from the federal government, we are opening an office in Singapore and expanding our reach across the region as well. So some of the ways of doing that is really just bringing as many voices to the table. So multi-stakeholder collaboration, whether it's track 1.5, track 2, track 1, diplomatic or conversations. We hold a conference every year in Singapore, the Canada and Asia Conference. Most of these conferences deal on or at least work around climate change and clean tech. So plenty of regional forums and workshops. We are very active in conducting policy-oriented research. So we conduct research that focuses on, or at least tries to contextualize climate change in the region for key stakeholders here with the goal of influencing policy discussions and policy around it. We work very closely with various partners across Singapore, whether it's universities, other think tanks, government as well. And I think we're just going to continue doing what we have engaged. We are starting an engagement, a program on engaging with younger scholars across the region as well. So engaging with youth, and through various NGOs as well, working with the civil society groups on anything related to climate change and sustainability. So we are really at that point of deepening our presence in the region. And as a Singaporean myself, I am very excited that we will be doing this there. And Singapore is an ideal place to do that. It's very active. It's increasingly active on anything related to climate change. It is yeah, there'll be more to come.
Thank you. Thank you for being talking also a lot about what the foundation is working on. And if folks are interested, please do check out the Asia Pacific Foundation site too. So both Hema and Ming Li talked a lot about community engagement. I was just wondering, what do Belicia and Melissa think about this? What does community mean in the context of addressing climate change in Singapore? And I know, Belicia, you have worked a lot with youth groups in your time, in a lot of the youth advocacy group like Lipat SG. And Melissa, you're very engaged with students and youth. So how can we build a sense of community around addressing climate change? And of course, Ming Li talks about a lot of her work on more democratic participatory frameworks. How can we instill that in Singapore? What sort of infrastructures can we build on? Belicia, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So I can, speak a little bit about the work that I did back in 2019. This was when, like Melissa mentioned, 2018 was when there was this really big wave of consciousness about climate change more broadly. And 2019 was around the time when there was this sudden growth in civil society groups that were not just focused on the environment, but very specifically on climate change. And so groups like SGCR, Nepal and SG had been around for a while, but like Speak for Climate, Singapore Youth for Climate Action, all of these groups, really came to the forefront. And one thing that I heard a lot while speaking to them about their work and what the experience of, being in climate advocacy was like, is that one thing one respondent told me is that there's no closure of the feedback loop, right? That's an exact quote. When it comes to consulting or like trying to give feedback to government bodies about climate policy, or like even to share views and concerns about climate change, there was this sense that there was no clear outcome that came from their advocacy work, which, you can imagine is frustrating from the amount of effort that they put in. And more broadly, there's just a sense that even as civil society groups, you're giving feedback, right? Which isn't quite the same thing as being involved in the policymaking process. So I think, and I'm saying this with the caveat that this was done in 2019 and I haven't updated this research. So it's possible that, this has changed and that there's been more processes put in place for more involvement in these kinds of things. But I would say that would be one thing that one piece of infrastructure that can be developed for more developed pathways for groups to be involved in policy making. And another thing also is that even within the climate movement, because it at the time that I was working with it, it was very, very young. And for a group to function like something like Aware or even the Nature Society, that takes time and training and lots of capacity building as well. So knowledge sharing within civil society is also really important for building up that kind of capability.
Yes, that's thank you, Belicia, for sharing.
Yeah. I just wanted
And
to build on that
yes, please.
briefly, if it's possible. So I tend to agree with what Belicia has said. I've just posted in the chat that the Singapore government has actually just published the consultation for the next nationally determined contributions for Singapore, which is due next year. And if any of you happen to read the Paris Agreement closely, you'll note that actually the NDC every 5 years is due 9 to 12 months ahead of the relevant COP meeting. So because next year's COP is happening in November in Brazil, technically the NDCs are due in February, right? So if you think about it, the government is doing public consultation now for 1 month. By the time the consultation ends on 5th of November, is there really enough time to consolidate everything and actually to incorporate it into the NDC? And if any of you, because it was only released yesterday morning, if any of you have actually gone through the questions, you'll notice that the questions are also not, at least in my opinion, I think it's not particularly meaningful also. They just ask you whether you strongly agree, neutral, disagree about the policies that exist. They don't actually tell you what they're thinking of in terms of the number, where the trajectory is going. So I wish there were a more meaningful process. I was one of the lucky ones that got to sit in on a closed door consultation. Being invited to the table is definitely a privilege here in Singapore. But what about the vast majority of Singaporeans and residents here in Singapore whose lives are going to be changed by the new trajectory, because the new NDC is for 2025 to 2035, right? Do we not have a say? Do they not have a say in what Singapore's future NDC will look like, right? And time is really running out for this. So if I were to also just briefly answer the question that was posed, how do you build a community around this? So for me, I try to be as honest as I can whenever I have to give talks, especially within the university setting, when I get invited to junior colleges, I'm just very frank, very open, with the caveat that, like, please don't get me in trouble, right? Like, I'm just saying this as an academic exercise. So, there's a lot of self-censorship, right? So same thing. And I would just tell people that I'm just giving you an insight as to how I think about these things. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm just saying this is how I think. And you can draw your own conclusions after you've done enough research. And so I'm trying to do is to offer them, some a safe space to talk about things that they probably already worry about and are concerned about, but it doesn't seem like it's possible out in the open sometimes. The civil society space is a tricky one to manage in Singapore, even up to recently. We've seen tensions between certain groups and the government because of things that they have said openly. And personally, I don't like the way this is happening, because I think both parties, both civil society and government, need to be open to having a dialogue, as opposed to like, oh, I don't like what you said, I'm just going to ignore you or not invite you to the table. So, but people who are in the know, who are in there, who are trusted, someone like myself, even, we're trying to bridge as much as possible, but it's exhausting, right? Because we've got our own jobs, we've got our own things to do. So I think we can all, in order to have a good community, a meaningful community, we should all keep our minds open, and be ready to accept that there will be people who are not unhappy about certain policies, who want more, and rightly so, right? They want more for themselves, their future, and to hear them out, right? Be really genuine about wanting to hear them out. Yeah, and not ignore civil society and youth. So that's what I have to add. Thanks.
Thank
And
you.
I know we're running out of time, but can I just jump in
Yes,
really quick
please.
with
Yes,
with
please.
I just want to also say that we talk a lot about community engagement with policy making and interfacing with the government, and of course that's a really critical part. But another part of this that is really important as well is that, especially now with so much like technology and all of these new market solutions that are coming up to tackle climate change, the way that these things are designed are also really consequential for how we're going to be able to deal with climate change, right? And in some ways, these things are even more closed off than the policymaking process to the average citizen, even though they are impacting all of us. And like carbon standards like Verra, for example, will have public consultations for their methodologies, but who has time to wade through a 200 like page, really, really dense carbon standard or like project documentation? So that's also another area where we can, think more about what does community engagement, like what could it look like there?
Thank you. I know the time is a little bit tight, and Hema, you may have to leave very soon. Just a quick kind of question for Hema and Ming Li in your research outside of Singapore. What are some frameworks or collaboration or initiatives that we might be able to, apply to the Singapore context or make sense to the Singapore context? Hema, please.
So we know climate change, broader sustainability issues are increasingly finding its way into trade agreements. And trade impacts all of us. And I think so. What's happening right now, at least with Canada, is that Canada is negotiating a free trade agreement with ASEAN. It's going to be a very high agenda item this week at the ASEAN meetings taking place, or the ASEAN that's taking place in Laos. So I think ASEAN is a key point or key venue of engagement for external stakeholders, including for Canada, right? So, and that includes its engagement with Singapore as well. So I think, ensuring that climate change remains a priority throughout these negotiations is going to be critical. There are multiple other avenues for engagements, and it goes beyond just, well, at least on the Canada side, the federal government level, there's this initiative called ICLAI, which looks at local governments that Singapore is very active in. So it basically is a network of local governments committed to climate action. So I would say those are probably the two ways.
Amazing, amazing. Ming Li, please.
Yeah, I think that the civil society space in Singapore obviously is really complicated, and there are really strong lessons you can draw from, for example, Thailand, which has a very strong and long history of, environmental movements. And you can kind of see how civil society at different levels, how they ally with each other on issues, even if they don't agree on everything. It's about how do you build an alliance based on, your common interests as well. And also how can you create kind of these spaces for participation that exists outside the government realm, because you can't just depend on the government to provide this meaningful space that we're all looking for, because their priorities are different as well. So, I've seen civil society create alternative consultation spaces with, the information that they got from the government, for example, and kind of, again, going back to what's been discussed, simplify these issues and creating a discussion on these issues in a way that's more accessible to a lay person, whether they be, at the village level or it could be a university student. How do you create these alternative sites of participation? And I think also recognizing that participation does not take place in a vacuum, right? Like, it's not just going to an event and like giving your feedback. I mean, I think, if you look at all of us and where we're here today, it's very much about what are the formative experiences that have gotten us to where we are today. So, Melissa and I were in the same cohort at NUS Geography, and like it was kind of being surrounded by that, whole gang of friends we all had like very similar interests around the environment, and being around that, going through these sort of experiences together, I think, and learning from each other, I think have been very important in terms of like keeping us motivated and working in the spaces that we are today.
Thank you. I love how we when I sent out emails to the panelists, I didn't know anyone knew each other. I know each of you like individually, but I'm so glad that folks actually know each other. So we have like maybe 8 minutes for Q&A. And if you have any questions, please unmute or type your question in the chat. And then if you have any questions, please go ahead from the audience. Okay. If there's no questions, I have some wrapping up questions for the panelists. So we come from many different backgrounds and many different expertise. So if you were to imagine a truly sustainable world, let's just drop all practicality, which Singapore tend to bring up quite a lot. What would that be? What would a sustainable future look like in your imagination, in your vision, and how far and how close are we from this vision? Hema, please go ahead.
I would say one that truly is inclusive in every way possible. And it's going to be a continuous affair, right? I don't think it's something that we can it's a one a goal that can be just met and then that's it, right? We've continuously got to be finding new ways of increasing our sustainability, bringing new voices to the table, and constantly having that conversation. And one that is truly also circular, because that's the other key aspect in all of this. So yeah, I think that would be the way I would picture that ideal world.
Melissa?
It's actually a really tough question. There's a lot of things I would like to have and I would want, especially for Singapore. But I think top of mind is really about, I mean, I wish everybody, as I said in the last comment I made, I think we should all really try and be as open-minded as possible. There are many different realities and experiences that we face as Ming Li shared. And we all live our own truths and we all want out the best for Singapore, for Singaporeans, right? And to have I feel like to have one group be pit against another sometimes is very disheartening. And I think if we could all really be as open as we can and be more willing to hear each other out, to have these healthy spaces for conversation and not having to go behind to try and orchestrate or make things happen. I feel that would reduce a lot of the burden or responsibility of people who are in the know and who are always trying very hard to create those spaces. Yeah, and we just make for a happier, time for people who consider themselves advocates for the environment, yeah, and climate action. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Let me pause for a bit. I think there's a question from the audience. Robert, do you want to type it or unmute?
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for having this conversation. Very, very important. I have a question on the Arctic, concerning the Arctic and climate change. My name is Robert. I teach at the Department of Political Science in the University of Delhi, where I'm joining from right now. I was wondering, like, there's a lot of sort of exuberance and excitement with the prospects of the Arctic melting away and new trade route, a shorter trade route from east to west being created on that, and countries are basically scrambling for opportunities around uh, the Arctic, especially Russia, for example. And I'm just wondering, like, if I haven't read so much about this, but I'm increasingly very interested in this region, and especially in the context of climate change. And I'm wondering if countries in their Arctic policies do sort of consider pause a little bit and consider climate change. Like my way of looking at it is like, how can that be a very exciting thing? Because when climate change melts polar ice caps, that's not going to be good for the planet as a whole. Least of all the region itself, because the region, there are people living there, the sort of the flora and fauna of the region, everything gets affected, and then that leads to sea level rise, and that has further implications down the line, or on various extreme climate events and so on. So our country is not seeing this when they propose, this sort of or when they're looking at it objectively or quote unquote strategically. Do they take this into consideration? I mean, anybody who can answer this would be nice. Thank you very much.
Okay. I'll take a stab at this.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much. Yes, Hema. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Climate change is a high priority in Arctic states' policies, as well as, and it's interesting. A lot of observer countries have their own Arctic policies as well, except Singapore. Singapore hasn't actually doesn't have a formal policy, but in every speech that it makes, its engagements, it does mention the importance or at least the reasons for its engagement, being the melting sea ice and all of that. So countries do. They do, and they do actively work on around the issue, whether it's on climate change or biodiversity conservation, black carbon pollution, which is a major cause of further melting of the sea ice. And they do this primarily, well, either domestically or through the Arctic Council. So the Arctic Council does a lot of work on sustainable development. Now, the problem is that what's happening elsewhere around the world is also contributing to what's happening in the Arctic. So it's not enough for just the Arctic states to be, battling climate change. It's a whole global effort. So what's happening thousands of miles away is going to be melting the sea ice in the Arctic. And unfortunately, it's a very tricky situation where I mentioned where the sea ice is already melting. And because of that, communities are extremely impacted. So when it comes to the Canadian Arctic, for instance, we see how that's impacting infrastructure. So, certain communities are increasingly more remote. It's very difficult to get day-to-day essentials up there, right? Whether it's laundry detergent, orange juice, these are extremely expensive to get up to the Arctic. So the thing is that keeping that in mind, we still do have to develop it, right? Because there are communities up there. But it's also really unfortunate because the Arctic is also a geopolitical theater and it's not weaponized, but it is increasingly militarized. And there's a lot of, and also it's because of the melting sea ice, there's a lot of interest on opening up the ship routes, which also is going to contribute to further melting of the ice. But there are certain regulations through the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, mandating certain requirements for ships. But I think that's an ongoing affair. But it is a tricky situation. We can't say no to development at all. But we have to do it in a very, very prudent manner.
Thank you so much, Hema. This is
Thank you.
incredible response. That we have another participant question. Salva, who's mentioned in the chat, climate change has always taken place. Why the excitement in now? Why is it in the now? And of course, Melissa, maybe Ming Li and Belicia, you can take a stab at this question. Ming Li, do you want to go ahead?
I'm just going to briefly mention
yes.
my answer before
Yes.
Ming takes the floor. I think it's mainly because the science has pointed us to the fact that actually man-made climate change, where humans have effectively put so much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere since the industrial times, that it's causing unprecedented changes. So I think you're speaking to natural climate variations, which I think given what the IPCC has said is we've gone far beyond that already, and so right now we're just trying to tackle the man-made part of it, the human-made part of it, and trying to reverse our actions.
Ming Li, please.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just briefly, if I guess the excitement is or excitement is kind of you're seeing it because again, yeah, like I think, the impacts of anthropogenic climate change are becoming increasingly clear, as Melissa has said. Even in Singapore, like we all notice it's getting hotter. And so, these physical manifestations of climate change, I think is kind of putting this impetus on people to act. And I think, um, and I say this with maybe a little bit of like a mix of optimism and pessimism, is because there are also like new markets developing around it. You have new players. You have I'm seeing kind of like philanthropies, businesses, governments, all finding new ways to work with each other as well. And while this is exciting, again, I would go back to our other point about Hema's point about how can this be inclusive, in very meaningful ways for those who are vulnerable.
Thank you. Belicia?
Yeah, sure. We have a question on the building policy and replacing green landscapes that I could actually speak to if you want to get to that. So you bring up a really good point, right, about concrete, and I don't know actually about how that would factor into emissions calculations for these industries. But what I can speak to is this idea that it's possible to offset green landscapes that you clear for the sake of new developments. And one of the fundamental ideas right now in biodiversity markets is that it's very, very difficult to offset impacts that you have on biodiversity, whether that's through like restoring, even if you like try to restore another area, it's very difficult to replicate the kind of complexity and diversity that that original landscape might have had. So even if it's a 1-to-1 ratio, like whether or not, it's the same thing is debatable. So the infrastructure company AECOM, spelled AECOM, has actually come up with an accounting methodology for biodiversity in Singapore, and it's quite thorough, and it's done, as good as a job as you can of trying to put a number on something as complex as biodiversity. And that's something that, people can check out to look at how the infrastructure sector is calculating the impact on things.
Okay, thank you so much. We are 15 minutes over the hour. I really want to thank our panelists for the incredible insights and being here in the PMs in our different time zones. And of course, I would like to extend my very special thank you to Asia Pacific Foundation for co-organizing this event. This is the first event of the Critical Malaya Studies Initiative, as well as my special thanks to the York Center for Asian Research and academia.sg for spotlighting this panel. And if you have any more questions, there will be a follow-up survey for the participants. So if there are any more questions for our panelists, I'll be able to bring it along with them. Thank you so much. And I would also love to hear your feedback with the post-event survey about what are some topics the audience would like to know more about covered through the initiative. So thank you so much, and have a good afternoon and evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ming. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.